is the lead commissioner for the groundbreaking Truth and Reconciliation Report, a report that produced 94 calls to action for Canada to address its historical and future record in its relationship with its Indigenous peoples. Today, in conversation with His Honor, Mr. Justice Murray Sinclair. Welcome to the program, Your Honor.
Well, thank you, Jamie. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak to your audience.
I'd like to start with letting our audience get to know you a little bit better. So tell me about growing up in Manitoba.
Okay, I grew up in Manitoba.
You also have a wonderful sense of humor.
I'm not sure what you need to know. So, there's a lot of details around that, some of which I am prepared to talk about, some of which I am not. But I spent most of my life in Manitoba. I really haven't lived anywhere else except in and around the Selkirk area where we had a long history as a family. Used to be an Indian reserve at one time back in the 19th century, but the government forced all the members off of the community and force marched them up to a community further north, or land further north. This was St. Peter's Reserve, as it was called at the time, was land that was prime agricultural land on both sides of the Red River, north of Winnipeg. And it was a land that the Indigenous people of the reserve had been farming for centuries, going back as far as history records show. And so the farmers were well used to having their farming operations in place here. But beginning in the 1880s until 1913, when the forced marches were finished, the government worked hard to force the people off the reserve because they wanted this prime agricultural land for settlers that they were importing from Europe. And so in order to accomplish that, they had to get the people of the community to voluntarily surrender the land through a referendum vote, which they said they did, but on a reference to the court, about a year or so after the vote was held, the court ruled that it was an illegal vote, an illegal surrender, and that therefore the surrender was invalid. So rather than returning the land back to the community and the members of the community, the government instead passed a law in 1916 called the St. Peter's Reserve Act, which says that because questions had been raised about the validity of the surrender, that the surrender would be legitimized through that law so long as every property owner who bought land on the former reserve paid an extra $1 per acre into a trust fund, which probably happened. We can't find the records that say that all of that money was paid in, but the end result was that the trust fund quickly disappeared into the government coffers, and none of that money ever actually went to the members of St. Peter's Reserve, particularly not to those who had large farming operations that left equipment behind, left animals behind, left their houses behind. So they were moved up into an area where they literally had to live in subhuman conditions for a number of years in order to reestablish a community up there.
So for your upbringing, based on that historical record that you've just shared with us, how did that impact you?
Well, I actually didn't know much about that because it's not taught as part of the history program in this area. It wasn't mentioned much in any of the public records. The only way that I knew about it was because from time to time I would hear the older people in the community speak about it. A number of families were able to avoid being forcibly removed because the court issued an order just before the military stepped in to forcibly remove the last 90 families or so, and ordered the military to stop doing that. So those families that were able to remain behind were able to stay on the land. And one of those families was my grandfather's family. And so he stayed on his homestead for the remainder of his life. But the story of the surrender was never taught in the schools. It was barely mentioned in any of the history books in this area, and certainly was never mentioned as part of the history of the town of Selkirk. The northern half of the town of Selkirk is now the city of Selkirk. The northern half of the city of Selkirk was in fact part of the Indian Reserve, but you never know that from reading the history of the town.
I want to fast forward a little bit here from your childhood to becoming a young man and then being called to the bar and becoming a lawyer. And your experiences in those early days of becoming a lawyer, you encountered cases of racism. And in many respects, I believe that they drove you to be the lead commissioner for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when that opportunity presented itself. Talk a little bit about those experiences as a lawyer.
Well, growing up Indigenous in Manitoba, you couldn't avoid the racism of the place. It stemmed from the history of Manitoba since Confederation, and Manitoba's inclusion into Confederation came about because of the resistance of the Métis people, the Scottish half-breeds, and the support that they received from the First Nations population nearby. And because of that history, the people who were brought in order to overcome that resistance stayed behind. And they were largely what we would now call right-wing extremists. They were Orange men. There were people who belonged to societies that believed in the inferiority of Indigenous people and actively worked to try to undermine Indigenous communities, Indigenous people, and were active racists against Indigenous people. And so the people of the old reserve who had remained behind were constantly being victimized by racist comments and racist treatment. And it was easy to see when you looked at the way the city itself developed that there were pockets of Indigenous populations within the town that only Indigenous people lived in. In the new developments, Indigenous people were not sold houses in those areas, even though sometimes they were just as affluent as many others because their trades at the time, hunting, fishing, trapping, were vital necessities for the local community to rely upon. So all of that history was denied to us, but on top of that, of course, the history of Indigenous people generally in Canadian society throughout North America was not particularly positively dealt with. I have said from time to time, in the course of my presentations, that public schooling in North America, particularly in Canada, was generally an education program that was based upon white supremacy, in that it was taught from a colonialist perspective. Canada started with the arrival of white European people, according to Canadian history books, and the only reason why Canada was able to become the great nation it is because of the work of those white Indigenous leaders over the years. No regard was made whatsoever to the fact that much of what they did was supported by Indigenous leaders who were encouraging the sharing of the land, and helping settlers, and doing what they could to be participants in the evolution of this nation. But when Confederation occurred under Sir John A. Macdonald, all of that was denied, and legislatively they became one of the most oppressed people in the world.
When you started to go into courtrooms, you've said that you experienced a lot of racism. You saw it there to the point where you actually considered stepping away from law. Is that the case? And what changed your mind? I understand you had a conversation with an elder that was very, very impactful for you.
One of the first experiences I had as an articling law student working with a law firm involved appearing in court. My family was very proud of the fact that I graduated from law and was going to be a lawyer. And they had spared everything that they could in order to prepare me for a career as a lawyer. They bought me a suit, they bought me new shoes, they bought me a briefcase, and generally tried to make me look like a lawyer in their eyes, what a lawyer was to look like. And on this one occasion, my first time I was ever sent to court, one of the senior lawyers in the office called me at home early in the morning and said, "You have to go to court up in a community just north of here." And he said, "You have to arrange for a remand because our client can't be there, and I can't make it up there, so you have to go." And so I said, "Sure, I could do that." So I put on my nice new suit. I picked up my beautiful empty briefcase, and off I went to the community. And when I got there, the hall was packed with Indigenous people who were quite surprised to see me and to learn that I was in fact a lawyer. But I realized on the way to the community that I actually didn't know what a remand was. They don't teach you that at law school. They don't teach you how to get it either. And so I didn't know what I was supposed to do when I got there. But I remembered the wise words of one of my law profs who said, when you get to court, if you're not sure what to do, just watch what the other lawyers do and do that. So I stood at the back of the hall in my suit, holding my briefcase. And I watched what the lawyers did when their clients' names were called, and they would stand in front of the judge and they would say, "We'd like a remand of 2 weeks, so we'd like a remand of 1 month." And so I thought, well, that's easy. I don't have to pay for it at least. And so when they called our client's name, I went to the front of the courtroom, walked all the way from the back of the hall, all the way through those people. And they all turned and looked at me, and I thought, wow, this is really something. Like they must be feeling very proud of the fact that one of their own is finally appearing in court. And so I get to the front of the court, front of the hall, which is where court was held. And I put my briefcase on the table like the other lawyers had done. And then I waited for the judge because the judge was writing something down. So I knew not to interrupt that. So I waited for the judge, and the judge finished his note making. And then he looked up at me, and he looked down at the list, and he said, yeah, he said, "What do you want?" And he said, and I said, "Well, Smith," that wasn't the name of the client, but that's the name that I gave. I said, "Smith, you called my client. You called Smith, sir." And he said, "Oh, okay, Smith." And he found the name on the docket. He said, "So, Smith, what are you charged with today?" And I said, "Well, it's not me. That's my client." I said, "I'm here to get a remand." He said, "What? How can you get a remand? You have to be a lawyer to get a remand." And I said, "Well, I am a lawyer." He said, "Really? I've never heard of you before." And I said, "Well, I am." And so he said, "Well, imagine that." I still remember that. Imagine that. And so that experience was devastating because of the obvious disdain that he had for the fact that I was purportedly a lawyer. On another occasion around that time as well, I was called by one of the lawyers who asked me to go down to the remand center in the city of Winnipeg to bail out a client who had been arrested for driving while impaired. And he needed someone to help him get bail. And so I jumped in my car and I drove to the remand center, and I spoke to the magistrate, and I said, "So what do we need to do in order for my client to make bail?" And she told me. And so I said, "Okay, I'll go see him in the cells and I'll make arrangements." So when I went to the cells, the police officer who was guarding the gate, he said, "Who are you?" And I told him. I said, "I'm so-and-so, and I'm here to see our client." Gave him his name. I said, because I just spoke to the magistrate, and he said that this guy can have bail. And I told the guard, I said, "I'm a lawyer. I'm articling with this law firm who represents him." He said, "Okay." He said, "Come on in." He opened the gate, put me in an interview room. He said, "I'll go get your client." So he went and got my client, brought him into the interview room. Now, I had just come from a day at the beach, sort of dressed for the day. I was wearing a t-shirt, had a shirt over top of it, but wearing a t-shirt and jeans. And so I told my client what the magistrate had said: you got to have somebody to post this much money, and you have to get someone to pick you up, and you got to stay out of trouble, and you got to promise, and you got to sign all these papers. And he said, okay, I'll do all that. Now my client had been coming from a wedding, and so he was wearing a suit and a bow tie, so he'd been part of the wedding party, I guess. And he said, I'll do it. So I went to the door, and I knocked on the door. Another guard came to let me out, and I said, okay. I said, I'm finished in here, and I said, I gotta go now. And he said, okay. He opened the door, and then he grabbed me, and he started taking me back to the cells. And I said, no. I'm the lawyer. He's the client. He's the guy who's in custody. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, sure he is. And kept pushing me back toward the cell. And I yelled over my shoulder to my client. I said, tell him I'm your lawyer. And just for a brief second, I could see that my client wasn't sure that he was going to say anything, but he did say, yeah, that's my lawyer. Don't lock him up, because then I can't get out of here. So with that persuasive word from that guy, who was not an Indigenous guy, he was a white guy, and they agreed to let us switch places, and I went back to the magistrate, and they brought him down and signed the papers. Those experiences, plus a number of others of a similar vein over the course of my work, the way that lawyers dealt with me, the way that sometimes even clients who I had appeared for because other lawyers couldn't appear for them, treated me, was pretty disheartening over the course of the year and the year after. And so finally I said, I don't know that I'm cut out for this. And I think what really threw it for me was that in that particular time frame, about 1981, the Prime Minister of the day, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, made an announcement that he was not going to allow Indigenous rights to go into the Constitution, because he said, if they can't agree with us on what they are, then we're not going to put anything in the Constitution about their rights. And that really angered me, and that just showed me how this use of law to oppress Indigenous people was still constantly going on. And so I decided to quit. I decided to quit being a lawyer. I said, I don't know that I'm going to ever make any change here. And before I made any decision, before I took any action on that decision, though, my wife convinced me to go and talk to an elder that we both knew, who I respected a lot. His name was Angus Merrick, who was a very wise guy, but more importantly, he was just a gentle, loving spirit, and knew his traditions and his customs, but he was also well aware of the court system because he worked as a court worker in a provincial court. And so I went to visit Angus. I called him up and I said, oh, I need to come and talk to you. And he invited me to come and sit with him. And when I got there, his wife directed me to go sit out in the teepee with Angus because he was waiting for me. And so I went and sat with him, and I visited with him all day. I sat in that teepee with him, and we drank tea all day. His family brought out some lunch for us, but we never left the teepee the whole time. And I talked to him for most of that time about how frustrated I was feeling and how difficult things were and how much I regretted going into law. And I decided that I was going to leave and I was going to go and be a carpenter, which was an area of work that I had done with my grandfather. And I knew I could do it. And I wanted to do something that I didn't have to face the constant barrage of treatment like that. And at the end of the day, after I finished speaking, he didn't say anything during the whole time. Angus said to me at the end of it all, he said, well, if you want to go and be a carpenter, he said, you go ahead, because you should not be doing things that hurt you. You should not be doing things that are constantly destroying your dignity. You're not ready for that. And go and be a carpenter. He said, you'll be a good carpenter. I know you will be. because you're a smart man and you'll work hard, I know, because it's something that you love to do. But remember this, he said, you may become a carpenter in your trade, but you will always know the law, and people will always come to you to help them understand the law. And so therefore, don't think that you can just turn your back on this knowledge. This knowledge now is part of you. So, but what you haven't figured out yet, though, is how you can be a lawyer and still be a strong man, a strong human being. And he said, because you don't know all about our teachings in that way. You don't know what it means to be a good son or a good father or a good husband or a good Muslim, a good grandfather, because you haven't heard those teachings yet. And that's what's really hurting you, is that you don't have the tools to be able to withstand that or deal with that. And so what you need to do, if you want to stay in this work, he said, is you need to learn what it means to be a Anishinaabe. And then if you learn that, he said, then you will be the best lawyer that you could ever be. And maybe one day you might become a judge, he said, then you will be the best judge that you could ever be. And if you do that, he said, then people will come to you, not because they see a good lawyer, but because they see a good Anishinaabe lawyer. And that's what they're looking for. They're looking for someone who they can identify with. He said, it's like when you walk into a room full of people, he said, the first thing you do when you walk into that room is you look for those people who look like you, because that makes you feel that you're in the place where you belong. And so you need to think about the fact that those people who are in those courtrooms, they don't belong there, but they need to feel that they are protected in there. And that's something that you can do. And so I stayed on as a lawyer, and things have led me now to this point.
And those are incredibly raw experiences that you have shared with us. Did they prepare you for what was to come in the testimony that you heard as the lead commissioner for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
Yeah, one thing that I always tell people is that I'm still on that journey of discovery. I'm still learning what it means to be a good human being, what it means to be a good Muslim in this day and age. I have grandchildren now, and it's important for them to know that their Muslim is a good man, is a good human being, and that he's somebody that they can love and that they can talk about. So that journey is not ended, and it's still going on. But I, over the course of the years, learned a lot from talking with elders and from going to ceremonies and listening to teachings from elders that prepared me for the work that I ultimately did as a judge with the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba. That also prepared me for the pediatric cardiac surgery inquiry when I was asked to conduct an investigation into the deaths of 14 babies. And it prepared me for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because those teachings were available to me to help me understand that there are tools available to give me the strength to cope with everything that I'm hearing, and to share the knowledge of those tools to help others to learn how to be able to get through this as well. And so I was not just able to sit as a judge and listen, but I also strove to lead the people who were dealing with us, our staff, other commissioners, but also the survivors. My ambition was to lead them in a way that would show that they would not be forgotten, and that their experiences would change the way this country would be forever.
You heard a tremendous amount of testimony, particularly from residential school survivors, and I'd like to get into that in just a moment. But before we do, when you took on the role of the lead commissioner, you looked at previous Indigenous proceedings, royal commissions and what have you, and you found one in particular related to pipelines in Western Canada, and a justice who had taken an approach where he went to the communities as opposed to the communities coming to him. You liked that approach, and it was very effective for you in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. Can you talk about that and why that was the right way to approach this?
Well, I was Thomas Berger's the individual you're talking about in the Berger inquiry was an important inquiry in the history of this country, largely because it gave an opportunity for the Dene people, it was primarily the Dene people, but others as well, to be able to speak in an environment in which they were comfortable about what this experience that they were going to be put through would likely do to them and to their children and to their future generations. And so that level of comfort and that level of security also gave them a sense of validation to be able to say what they were saying. And I could see that as I was observing that process from afar. And I love that process so much that, in fact, I told people when we were doing our hearings in the North that I gave to one of my daughters their name. So I have a daughter named Dene, because I was so impressed with the fact that they had come forward to stand up for themselves in that way, and Justice Berger gave them that opportunity. So going to the community and listening to people was also the way that we did the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. We went to just about every Indigenous community in Manitoba, and I thought that was the way that we were going to do the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as well. People know about the 7 national events that we held in the major urban areas, but what they're less aware of is the fact that we went to hundreds of small communities throughout Canada, listening to residential school survivors in their home communities. And during the course of the TRC, I traveled by boat, I traveled by winter road, I traveled by helicopter, traveled by small airplanes, traveled by skidoo, traveled by dog team in one community, just to be able to get to the place where the people were ready to gather and listen to each other, and where we could listen to them. And that was important, to give them that opportunity and that sense of not only believing in the process, but also belonging together to each other, to supporting each other. And this is, I think, an essential, successful feature of the TRC.
Your Honor, you heard some heart-wrenching testimony, particularly from survivors of the residential schools. What sticks with you from that testimony?
Well, the one overriding feeling that we had, and as commissioners, we debriefed after every day, of course, but the one overriding sentiment that we came out of this whole experience was this sense of huge responsibility we had to those survivors, to hold their stories close and to ensure that their stories were never forgotten. We made a commitment to do what we could to create a national memory, so that in 50 or 100 years from now, nobody in Canada would ever be able to say that never really happened, because there's no record of it. It's just a whisper thing that people are now coming up with. So we wanted to ensure that the public was forever changed by it. And that also marked the way that we did the hearings, because we couldn't find a national televised participant to travel with us and televise the entire process. We were able to do that with the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. We got a cable company that traveled with us and broadcast all of our hearings. But the national perspective was just too much for anybody to undertake with the TRC. So what we did was we developed a way, utilizing our young Indigenous technicians, to webcast everything that we did. And so we encouraged people who had access to computers to watch all the proceedings on computer. And at one point, when at one of our hearings, as we were closing down in Ottawa, our technicians who can track these things through data collection processes were telling us that there were 62,000 computers that were connected to our hearing on that day, and that they estimate that because some of the computers were in large gymnasiums with large classes and groups of students, large groups of survivors, they estimated that an average of 5 people per link up were watching us. So they estimated that 300,000 people were watching us on that particular day. And we were in a room that held about 2,500 people, but our reach was quite significant. And I think that we need to understand that that's one of the reasons why the TRC had such an impact, is because we included the public in this as well. And one of the challenges we had at the beginning always was, how can we get the public to care about this? They knew about the devastating history of Indigenous people. They knew that Indigenous people had been oppressed. That was generally known throughout Canadian society. But what we needed to do was we needed to get them to care. And how can we get them to care? And we get them to care by bringing them into the room, by getting them to sit beside the survivors, to feel that they are being part of this process and that they feel affected by it. And I think that's been the greatest success of the TRC itself.
There were 94 recommendations that your commission made, dealing with everything from justice to childcare, healthcare, education. How do you feel about it now, 5 years plus later, after the report was released? How successful has it been? Where are there still areas that Canadians need to do more?
Well, all of those calls to action are still require attention. And one of the things that people need to understand is that reconciliation is not a one-time event. This is not where you say, well, yeah, okay, I did that, now I can check it off. You have to do those things every day. And that's why we were able to focus on 94 calls to action. And other inquiries that I have observed and in previous ones that I was part of, the recommendations numbered in the hundreds, and some of them were very detailed recommendations. But the calls to action that we put together were really calls to action which had an overriding theme. And what we were saying was, every day you need to think about this. You need to think about this from the perspective of this. If this had happened to you, what would you want done about it? How would you feel about this? And so the government is fond of saying that they have implemented 48 of the 94 calls to action, and various entities have said that they have implemented various of the calls to action within their organization. In a conversation I had with the Prime Minister when that number was thrown out on the table, I said, well, that's great. I said, so what are you going to do next year? Because when you leave office, or next year when those other people who are working in government leave office, what are you going to make sure to do to ensure that this continues to happen? Because these are not one-time events. We talk about the need to educate the public service, for example, around the history of Indigenous treatment in this country. And they say, yeah, so we've got an education program that senior managers are required to attend. And so who measures their attendance? Who ensures that they're actually there? Who ensures that the next group of managers are attending a program like that? You're just going to do it one time? Because you can't.
And you've said before that the world is watching. It's not just Canadians are watching.
Yes.
And you've been called on by other governments in other countries to respond and help them respond to Indigenous historical mistreatments. What can you share with us about that?
Well, with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, passed by the United Nations back in 2012, approximately. The impact of that upon the various nations of the world where there are acknowledged indigenous populations still active and still present, it has forced governments to recognize that they have a lot of work to do, that they have to understand and appreciate what it is that either that government or the previous administrations have done to indigenous people, and the consequences of that to the indigenous people of those countries. And so the result is that sometimes they're struggling to try to figure out what to do next, what should be our plan of action. And so I have been asked to speak to senior officials in various governments, even South Africa. South African officials came to see me to talk about what can they do better? Where did they go wrong? Why is it so difficult to achieve reconciliation within their country? One of the things I always tell people is that you got to remember that in Canada, it took us about 11 generations of people to create this mess that we now have, to create this damaged relationship that we're faced with every day. And we can't expect to fix it within one generation. We can't expect to fix it within one term of government. It's not going to happen that quickly. And anything that happens that quickly is not going to have any lasting consequence. So we need to figure out, as part of the plan of action, what can we do that will have the best long-term impact and long-term consequence for the country in terms of achieving a balanced relationship, a much better relationship than we now have. And many governments that are facing the challenge of coming to terms with their history, their past, are not thinking of it in those terms. They're thinking of it in terms of how much money do we have to pay these individuals to compensate them for the damage that they've experienced? What's it going to cost us in terms of healing programs? What's it going to cost us in terms of this and that? And my response always is, well, you can get economists and health people and others can tell you what the dollar amounts are going to be. But really, the real question you have to ask yourself is, if you were to set out to damage a people, did you ask yourself then, what is it going to cost us to damage all these people this badly? No, you didn't. You just went ahead and did it. And so what you need to think about is, what do we need to do in order to help this relationship become the kind of relationship that it should be? Because nobody's going away here. Nobody's going to disappear. Europeans are not going to go back to Europe. And indigenous people are not going to decide to pack up all their bags and go to a different country. That's their land. That's where they were born. They've been there for thousands of years in most cases. And so what needs to be done is to figure out how to make that relationship one of mutual respect, mutual understanding, and also that also returns a degree of self-respect to the indigenous people who had it torn away from them for so many generations.
June 21st is National Indigenous Peoples Day in this country. What advice can you give to non-Indigenous Canadians?
Well, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now, so of course anything that happens is going to be part of a limited event, so we need to understand that. But in the overall scheme of things, dealing with National Indigenous Peoples Day on June 21st, it was really intended as a day of recognition of Indigenous peoples in this country, the fact that Indigenous peoples are still here. And so acknowledging that by participating in events that honor that fact is important. I've encouraged communities to consider marking it in terms of school activities. It's not an official holiday in any place in Canada. So utilizing it for school events, utilizing it to increase the knowledge level of what the children are being taught, contributing to changes in the curriculum in our schools so that Indigenous and non-Indigenous children being educated in our public schools now are being educated in a way that gives them the opportunity to have mutual respect for each other growing up. And so I think that what we need to think about is on National Indigenous Peoples Day on the June the 21st is to, where there is a permissible public event, participate, become part of that. If there is an activity going on that you can support, then support it. If it involves contributing some money to it, then contribute. If it involves sending some supplies to schools or sending some clothing to people who are in need, then do that. But most importantly, I think, is that it's also a time for us to recognize that part of our fight is not just to come to terms with this past, but part of it is also to deal with the consequences of it. So we should really be thinking about that as a national day to fight racism in this country when it comes to Indigenous people. And so just ask yourself the question, what can I do today to combat racism in this country? And do it. You know, post something on social media, or tell a story about a friend that you've got, or go and visit your friends, or call up your friends and just say, how you doing? Miss seeing you. That's the kind of thing that I would encourage.
Your Honor, I wish we had more time. I've already taken more time than we originally had scheduled, but it is a meaningful conversation. And on behalf of all Canadians, thank you for the work that you did with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and thank you for moving this forward.
Well, I always felt, and I said it during the course of the TRC's work, that I always felt that that work that we were asked to do was a sacred trust that we were given. Willie Littlechild, who was one of the commissioners, and I come from traditions of very strong cultural understandings about where our purpose in life comes from. And Marie Wilson, the other commissioner, she also was very connected in spiritual terms to her mentor, church leader in the United Church, all of whom said that that this was the kind of thing that would be appropriate to achieving what it was that the Creator intended for this world to look like, if we were able to hear the words directly that he would have said. Learning to live beside each other is an important part of the humanity that he or she granted to us.
Thank you for that. One of the most important pieces of work in Canadian history.
Yeah, thank you.
Today, in conversation with the Honorable Murray Sinclair, the lead commissioner for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, now released more than 5 years ago. Still much work to do, but the 94 calls to action continue to remind Canadians about what we need to do moving forward. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on YourTV.